This wasn't just a conversation, it felt like a test. A moment where power didn't whisper, it demanded proof. When Donald Trump reportedly threw out a challenge, Kash, see if you can top that, it didn't sound like strategy. It sounded like something deeper, something sharper, a shift from leadership to loyalty. Because here's the truth nobody says out loud. When the room stops being about truth and starts being about allegiance, everything changes. Decisions get distorted. Priorities get blurred. And suddenly the question isn't what's right, it's who's with me. And when that question is aimed at someone like Kash Patel, a figure tied to intelligence, authority, and national security, it raises a chilling thought. What happens when loyalty becomes the currency of power? What happens when institutions designed to protect the truth are tested by personal allegiance instead? This is not just a moment. This is a signal. A signal that challenges how leadership is defined, how trust is built, and how far influence can reach when it stops asking for excellence and starts demanding loyalty. Because in the end, the most dangerous shift isn't loud, it's subtle. It's when leadership stops inspiring and starts testing. Power shifts the moment leadership stops offering direction and starts demanding proof. What looks like strength on the surface can quietly become a test of loyalty underneath, where the real question is no longer can you lead, but will you submit? In moments like the one surrounding Donald Trump and Kash Patel, the dynamic reveals something deeper about male psychology. Men are wired to compete, to prove, to rise when challenged. But when that instinct is triggered by authority instead of purpose, it shifts from growth to compliance, from excellence to performance. Men often interpret these moments as arenas, places where dominance must be established and hierarchy must be respected. Women, however, tend to read the same moment through a different lens, one that questions emotional intelligence, trust, and the long-term stability of that leadership. Where men might see a challenge to overcome, women often see a signal of insecurity, a need for control disguised as confidence. And in that contrast lies the real tension, because when leadership becomes a test, it stops being about building others up and starts being about measuring who falls in line, who speaks up, and who is willing to risk everything just to stay in the room. The moment loyalty outweighs truth, leadership stops being a pursuit of clarity and becomes a contest of allegiance. In the tension surrounding figures like Donald Trump and Kash Patel, what emerges is not just political theater, but a deeper psychological pattern, one where men are often conditioned to equate loyalty with strength. For many men, loyalty is not passive, it is identity. It becomes a badge of honor, a signal of belonging, and sometimes even a measure of worth inside hierarchical systems where proving oneself matters more than questioning what is right. Men tend to interpret loyalty as survival inside the group. To challenge it can feel like exile, and to question it can feel like weakness. That is why in high-pressure environments, truth often becomes secondary to alignment. Women observing the same dynamic often register something different beneath the surface, a shift from integrity to dependency, where decisions are no longer anchored in what is correct, but in who is protected. From their perspective, loyalty without truth feels unstable, like trust being replaced with obligation. And in that imbalance, leadership begins to lose its moral center as men navigate between speaking honestly and staying accepted within the structure that defines their place in it. Power doesn't ask, it demands proof. And in that demand, it reveals the psychology of those who stand beneath it. When moments like the exchange involving Donald Trump and Kash Patel surface, they expose a deeper human instinct in men, the urge to validate their place through action under pressure. Men are often conditioned to respond to authority as a challenge to be met, not a question to be discussed. In that space, proof becomes currency and silence becomes risk. Men tend to internalize power structures as arenas of performance where every response is measured against strength, competence, and control. When power demands proof, it activates something primal, an urge to demonstrate value rather than question intent. For many men, failing to respond feels like erasure, while responding incorrectly feels like defeat. Women, however, often perceive this dynamic differently. They are more likely to sense the emotional undercurrent behind the demand, the insecurity that power sometimes masks. The need for validation disguised as authority, the pressure that replaces dialogue with testing. Where men see a challenge to rise toward, women often see a system that is quietly shifting from, have collaboration into control, where proving oneself becomes more important than understanding why proof is being demanded in the first place. Influence begins with inspiration, but control begins the moment that inspiration is replaced by expectation. In situations like the dynamic involving Donald Trump and Kash Patel, what appears as leadership on the surface can quietly shift into something more calculated beneath it. Men are often drawn into this space through their psychology of structure and hierarchy. They are taught, consciously or not, that respect is earned through response and that standing firm under authority is a form of strength. So when influence starts tightening into direction, many men don't immediately resist, they adapt, they perform, they prove. Men tend to experience this blur between influence and control as a challenge to identity. They interpret guidance as opportunity, but repeated testing as expectation. In that shift, autonomy can slowly feel conditional, tied not to truth but to alignment. Women observing the same environment often detect a different signal. They are more sensitive to the emotional shift where inspiration no longer feels voluntary but subtly enforced, where agreement is less about shared belief and more about maintaining position. From their perspective, the erosion of influence into control is rarely sudden, it is incremental, marked by tone, pressure. And the growing absence of open space for disagreement without consequence, silent agreement, has a cost that rarely shows itself in the moment. In rooms shaped by authority and hierarchy, especially when figures like Donald Trump and Kash Patel are part of the psychological backdrop, men often learn that speaking less feels safer than speaking truth. Men are conditioned to read silence as respect, even when it slowly becomes self-erasure under pressure. What begins as loyalty inside male-dominated structures can quietly turn into agreement without understanding. Women, observing this pattern, often notice something men are trained to overlook, that harmony built on unspoken compliance carries emotional instability beneath it. In that space, truth is not rejected loudly, it is simply not rewarded. The hidden cost of silent agreement is not immediate, it is cumulative. Men often interpret unspoken expectations as signals of strength, responding by aligning rather than resisting, especially in environments where authority feels absolute. In moments where influence shifts into control, silence becomes a form of participation, even when it contradicts personal conviction. Women tend to recognize this earlier, sensing when agreement is no longer rooted in belief, but in the fear of losing position or acceptance within the group. What appears as cooperation from the outside can, from a psychological lens, be a quiet surrender of independent judgment. Inside structures shaped by figures like Donald Trump and Kash Patel, men may not even notice the transition, because the reward system often favors agreement over authenticity, reinforcing the idea that staying aligned matters more than staying honest in the moment. Real leadership is not revealed in the moment of pressure, but in the space where people feel safe enough not to be tested at all. When dynamics involving figures like Donald Trump and Kash Patel are viewed through a psychological lens, they highlight a deeper divide in how leadership is perceived. Men, especially in structured hierarchies, are often shaped to believe that trust must be earned through performance under pressure. They are taught that proving themselves in demanding moments is what grants them belonging, respect, and stability within the system. So when leadership begins to test them, many men instinctively respond not with resistance, but with effort, because effort has always been the currency of acceptance. Real leadership, however, shifts that entire framework. Men begin to grow differently when they are not, constantly proving themselves, but instead trusted to show who they already are. In that environment, confidence is no longer reactive, it becomes stable. Women observing this dynamic often recognize the emotional difference more quickly. They tend to sense when leadership is rooted in control disguised as challenge versus when it is rooted in genuine belief in others. From their perspective, trust creates expansion while testing creates contraction. One builds openness, the other builds caution. The psychological impact on men is significant because many have learned to associate pressure with value. When leadership removes constant evaluation and replaces it with trust, they create a safe and supportive environment for growth and development. Men often perform not out of fear of falling short, but out of commitment to something larger than approval. In contrast, when testing becomes the default language of authority, even capable men begin to second-guess intent, read between unspoken rules, and adjust behavior not to grow, but to avoid failure within. Have environments influenced by authority figures such as Donald Trump and Kash Patel, this distinction becomes even more visible because the difference between being tested and being trusted determines whether people rise freely or operate under quiet psychological pressure that shapes every decision they make.